Hello and welcome once again to the Word for the Week podcast. We've been looking at a short series in warfare and response to the threat of war, wars and the rumours of wars. And today we're coming to a very odd incident in the history of the Old Testament people of God. And it's probably a story you know the outline of, but it's not always terribly well understood. We're coming to the story of that, well, people think of him as the greatest underdog of all, David facing Goliath. Welcome to the Word for the Week. So, the Israelites were at war with the Philistines, and their champion Goliath, a giant, taunted the Israelites daily, challenging them to send out a warrior to fight him in the valley between their opposing forces. And the Israelites, faced with such a symbol of power and strength and warriordom, were, you might think justifiably, terrified. And that justification would stack up if it were the case that you were not committed to the God of the Bible. The God who had already been shown for several thousand years to be zealous for his glory and faithful to his covenant with his people. If you weren't on side with that God and with that Bible history of his relationship with his people, then yes, the terror could well be seen as justified. But that's the background to these people, you see. That's the background to Israel in that day, from which David stands out. They've lost their grip on the glory of the God of the Bible, and they've ceased to be clear that he's the covenant-keeping God. And that explains why, when Goliath marched out, Israel's warriors' knees were wobbling in their tents. Those are the sort of people that are going to be terrified in any conflict to uphold the glory of God. So the clear conclusion to come to here is that these people, the young David was visiting at the front line on that famous day, were not manifesting the sort of response you get from people of faith. If you want to see a faithful response to the taunts of the Philistines, you don't look to the king of Israel, who was supposed to lead his people in battle, or any of the great and mighty warriors. You look to David, a young shepherd, who was totally indignant at Goliath's defiance of the armies of the living God. In the presence of God's anointed king and of the greatest warriors trembling like little lambs beside the battlefield that day, David expressed his confidence in God, saying, "This is ridiculous. Pad me up. I'm going into bat." 1 Samuel 17:37. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And armed only with a sling and a very limited number of stones, smooth pebbles from the brook, David confronted heavily armed, heavily armoured Goliath. And he did it in an absolutely no turning back sort of way, proclaiming the battle belonged to the Lord. 1 Samuel 17 verses 45 to 47, David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I'll give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Well, if you didn't know the end of the story, this is where you, the hearers, would gasp at the audacity of the young man. David isn't just putting his own life on the line, though. He's making it a contest with God's glory at stake. But we do know the end of the story. In a way, that's the problem with sensing the scale of the situation deep down in our own souls. But anyway, David struck Goliath with a stone to the forehead, killing him instantly, and the Philistines fled. David's faith and reliance on God saw God proving faithful and reliable to his covenant son, leading to an impactful victory for Israel and the vindication of God's own name and glory among the nations. Now, you will find books that say daft things about what this is all about. This story teaches us not that God favours the underdog. I'm thinking here of the men like Martin Gladwell's David and Goliath, Underdogs, Misfits and the Art of Battling Giants book. Nor is it showing us that faith in God overcomes human fear. Not even faith in God overcomes human incapacity and weakness. No, that's not right. That's not what it shows. David's pattern of expression is clear. It's not the faith David puts in God that overcomes. It is that God overcomes all those things through his people being ready to trust him and act on the basis of their theological convictions. But it is not that we overcome, nor that faith overcomes, but that the God in whom we trust overcomes. It is his doing, and the glory must be his. So what happens here is that God conquers the enemy of his glory being known, the Philistine, who derides the God of the armies of Israel. But God nonetheless does it through the agency of those people who will put their lives on the line for him, who will ignore the apparently overwhelming odds, who will laugh at the mighty in muscle, but the puny in God, and who will go where God sends them to do what he tells them, determined and ready to live or to die in his service, and who do it convinced that it is not they, in their apparent human weakness, that are on the back foot in their trials and their conflicts, but the Goliaths in their life that are totally outclassed in their attempts to seize from God his glory. Now, where are the men like that who will do that? Where are the women like that who will do that? Where are these people who, acknowledging and remaining conscious of their own human weakness, put themselves and their lives on the line for God's glory, confident in the sovereignty of their glorious God? Where are they? They are in northeast Nigeria, troubled by Al-Shabaab. In Chad, in Burkina Faso, they're in Afghanistan, they're in Iran, they're in China. And they're moving out into a physically dangerous world where they are living and dying in God's service because they are consumed with a gratitude for grace and a passion that God should be glorified in the salvation of the lost. And Wales? Poor Wales. It has only us to stand out for our God and his glory here, to live insisting that our God is faithful to us, and to proclaim with full passion that we are not sufficient in spite of all human boasting, and to live adamant that he will not give his glory to another, and that neither should we succumb or acquiesce to anything like that, but hold forth his glory to our people in our generation, and not the glory of his people or his church or, inverted commas, wonderful me. Okay, so let's start looking at what it's actually got here in the text and how it's presented to us. 1 Samuel 17 verses 1 to 11. The introduction and the setting of the scene. So in verses 1 to 3, the Philistines and Israelites gather for battle in the valley of Elah, with the Philistines on one hill and the Israelites on another. And in verses 4 to 7, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, is introduced, his formidable height, his armour, his weaponry, all detailed, emphasising his seemingly insurmountable strength. And then that tank of a man. In verses 8 to 11, Goliath challenges the Israelites to single combat, mocking them in their God, creating and stoking an atmosphere of fear. Now we can get into all sorts of distracting discussions about Goliath's actual height and his actual armour, but what's the point? What these texts emphasise is both Goliath's intimidating physical presence and the way that this tank of a guy, armour-plated and invincible, apparently, is the portrayal, the symbol of the pretense, the sheer pretense that this is, of human, overwhelming strength. And in analysing the rhetoric of this section, it's the unavoidable conclusion. The detailed description of Goliath's armour highlights his invincibility from a human perspective. And that's created a massive contrast with the simplicity of David's approach. In terms of the theology here, we're being given an insight into the theme of fear versus faith, as it were, where the blindingly stark contrast is being drawn between Saul's fear, the fear of the anointed king, whose role was actually to lead his people in battle, but who was left quivering in his tent, and the attitude of the shepherd boy, the youngest in his family, whom Saul described as but a youth in verse 33, up against the battle-hardened Philistine, who'd been a warrior from his youth. And that becomes, obviously, a key theme in the narrative. So in that introduction to the setting, in verses 1 to 11, human strength against divine power, God's power. Goliath embodies human arrogance and reliance on physical might, setting the stage for the triumph of divine power through weakness in faith. Secondly, verses 12 to 30 then introduce David and his reaction to the challenge of the Philistine. Verses 12 to 18, we meet David, the youngest son of Jesse, but not before we give him this juicy little nugget that's kind of dropped in almost randomly, but I'm sure intentionally, in verse 16. For 40 days the Philistine came forward every morning and evening and took his stand and taunted Israel to come to war, 40 days he came forward every morning and evening and took his stand. Morning and evening, the times of Jewish worship. The Philistine came forward for 40 days to mock them and their God, that's the issue, as they went to worship him. And into this context, David is sent by his father to deliver supplies to his brothers at the battlefront, bringing a jarringly different character into the scene on the battlefield in question. And then in verses 19 to 23, of course, David hears Goliath's taunts and he inquires about the challenge, showing some measure of curiosity and courage. But that isn't the main point. It's moving us forward quickly to verses 24 to 30, where the Israelites' fear is hugely contrasted with David's righteous anger at the taunting of Goliath, his mocking of Israel's God, and the obvious exposition of David's eagerness to get out and confront Goliath over God's glory. Whenever Goliath came out to the armies of Israel, those armies of Israel fled from him. But as soon as David saw what happened, he responded, verse 26, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the tone of this dialogue seems really significant. David's response is he's portrayed with boldness, showing his faith in God and his zeal for God's honour over Israel's army, highlighting the difference in perspective between David and those people around him. And the real difference is rooted in the fact that David's overriding concern was that the name of the Lord, the glory of his God, was being assaulted here. And that wouldn't do. David's reaction reflects a zeal for God's reputation, emphasising this key theme of divine glory and honour and demonstrating the difference between Saul and his fearful fighters and the shepherd, indignant at the affront to his God's glory, leading to David's faithful, fearless demonstration of his passion for the honour of his God. That passion for God's glory lives, burns in the heart of a person who on this battlefield has really only got God going for him. Nothing else to offer. And in that setting, David proves very willing to embrace his human weakness and stand out for God regardless. And there's a crucial spiritual principle at work here. We see that principle unfolding in verses 31 to 40 of 1 Samuel 17. In verses 31 to 33, Saul initially casts enervating doubt on David's human ability, emphasizing his inexperience and his small stature. And then in verses 34 to 37, David recounts his past victories, his past experience of taking things on in the name of his God. His victories over a lion and a bear, attributing his success to God's deliverance, stating his faith that God will, again, once more, deliver him from Goliath. Get this, is fantastic. David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it." Get this. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. You see, Saul is just so overwhelmed with a totally secular view of where power comes from and what it looks like. He's so overwhelmed with that secular view of ability that in verses 38 to 40, Saul offers David his armour. It's not a great fit for him in so many ways. And so David declines the armour, choosing instead to rely on his poor, weak-looking, familiar tools, a sling and some stones. But that's not the issue. It's not choosing the familiar that's going on here. David's refusal of Saul's armour symbolises his reliance on God rather than human wit, wisdom and might. Now, David's simple shepherd background is getting emphasised. His underdog status, even with his brothers and amongst his family, is beyond doubt, and our passage is clearly highlighting that God uses unlikely means to accomplish his purposes. And there's a crucial New Testament principle that underlies this narrative. 1 Corinthians 1, 26 to 29. Paul writes to the Corinthian church, "Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him." David has confidence, born of God's past faithfulness, when the lion and the bear had threatened the solitary shepherd boy in the wilderness. And David is confident of his God's intervention. And that heartfelt confidence of faith and that practical reliance on the God who supplies his people's needs, placing confidence in God's empowerment over against confidence in human tools. That drives David's choice of the sling and stones over massive battlefield armour. And it exemplifies David's reliance on God's power rather than on any human strength. In fact, David took off the best of Israel's armour, the suit worn by the king, in order to reject human strength and self-adequacy to be able to fight Goliath God's way. Well, that brings us to verses 41 to 47 of 1 Samuel 17, the confrontation with Goliath. And this is remarkably short. Because onto the scene lumbers the parody of human strength, confident in his own sufficiency to deal with the challenges of his day. Verses 41 to 44, Goliath approaches David with disdain, mocking him for coming with only a sling, and he curses David by his Philistine gods. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over and saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." Nice guy. Well, that turns out to be a very ironic choice of words there from the Philistine, given what Almighty God's got planned for Goliath's day. Without batting an eyelid, and still driven by his passion for God's glory, verses 45 to 47, David responds. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I'll give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel." That's very significant, but he hasn't finished yet. "All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." What you've got there is couched as a challenge to Goliath, but actually, there's a challenge here to us. What is that challenge? Well, look here. Dangerous David is living his theology. It always looks dangerous to do that. With a declaration of faith, affirming that he comes in the name of the Lord of hosts, David proclaims that the victory belongs to God. Now that is the lesson that's built out on Israel's foundation. What foundation? Well, when Israel was in Egypt's land, Moses told old Pharaoh, "Let my people go." And Pharaoh's very reasonable seeming response was pretty much, "Who do you think's going to make me?" Octogenarian Moses had headed into Egypt with a limp and a stick and very little else to support him, apart from the faithfulness of Jehovah, the great I Am, who'd appeared to call and command him in the flames of a curiously burning bush. And in Moses' life and in the wandering in the wilderness, when their world was hand to mouth, Almighty God had provided the equalizer in his people's case. The presence of their God with his people. The battle belongs to the Lord. And when Joshua and his armies faced the walled might of Jericho, in weakness they just walked silently, obeying their God. And the battle belonged to the Lord. See, dangerous David is living his theology. Compare and contrast the dialogue of the men in that fight there. Goliath's insults and curses contrasting clearly with David's faith-filled proclamation, marking a shift in Israel from fear to dangerous divine assurance. It's spelled out for us in the text. David has got no doubts about what's going to happen that day. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." Goliath, comes the message, mate, in spite of appearances, you really haven't got a chance. Of course, Goliath had some fairly spiteful things in disdain of David, who's come out against the Philistine fighter that day, that he's going to say. But David's own name is simply not of much interest to David. His concern is for the name, the honour and glory of his God. And David makes that the central issue in the outcome that occurs on this day. The name of the God of the armies of Israel is what will be at stake, says David, and that will be vindicated or vanquished in the outcome of the contest that day. And framing it like that requires more faith, even more courage even, than the personal risk that David is facing. Yes, his life's on the line, but David is framing it like this, and using this title for God signifies God's supreme authority over all armies and powers, the God of the armies of Israel. And establishing that is the outcome that fills the thoughts and the words of David as he descends into the valley to tackle the big lad on the day. The theology that David is living exalts God's own honor and glory. David stating clearly his faith that true power resides in God, not in faith, and neither in weapons or size. But there's a culturally massive extension built on the side of that which was earth-shattering in the theological context of Canaan, where deities were local, not universal. And here it is. David is clear that the victory God will give him will have truly international, worldwide, cosmic consequences. His battle plan for the day is that verse 46, the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And there you have in a nutshell the missionary theme of the Old Testament. Well, fifthly in the text here, we come to the victory in the aftermath, 1 Samuel 17:48-58. As they come out towards one another and as Goliath taunts him, David responds faithfully and then runs towards Goliath, verses 48-49, striking him down with a single stone. And that fall of Goliath represents a dramatic reversal of the first listeners' expectations. Verses 50-54, David cuts off Goliath's head with a giant's own sword, and the Israelites pursue the fleeing Philistines, securing a famous victory. And everyone is stunned at what David has done. See, the way they're expressing themselves after that, they still haven't got a clue. Verses 55-58, Saul inquires about David's family background, highlighting David's rise from obscurity. Mistake, Saul, mistake. This should not be a matter of inquiring where David has got his secret source from amongst his merely human lineage. He certainly hasn't got his secret source from there. All his brothers, like everyone else there under the leadership of King Saul, were like all of Israel's army quivering in the camp. Proving his genetics wasn't the key to this. They'd spent morning and evening facing the taunts of the enemy, not in the fear of God, but in the fear of Goliath. David's secret source doesn't lie in his family, in his background, his genetics, but his God. Incidentally, did you notice the symbolic imagery here in David's use of Goliath's own sword to complete the victory? God habitually uses an enemy's perceived strength in which they trust instead of trusting in him, and turns it against themselves. Okay. David's triumph is a testimony not to the faithfulness of David, but to the faithfulness to David of the Lord of hosts, his God, reinforcing that victory comes not by might, but by divine empowerment and intervention, as David put his trust in the Lord. So let's try and find some sort of conclusion, the theological takeaways from 1 Samuel 17. Faith overcomes the temptation to fear. Of course it does. 1 Samuel 17:24-26. David's willingness to face Goliath contrasts with the fear of the Israelite soldiers, illustrating that faith in God sends believers to the Lord looking for his power to confront daunting challenges, the challenges that must be faced for the sake of God's name. Secondly, we see here that God's people put God's honor above all. You could look at chapter 17, verse 26, or verses 45-47. David's motivation is God's honor, not David's own personal glory. His words reflect the zeal for God's name, emphasizing the primary purpose of the battle is to demonstrate God's supremacy, his glory, and that is something that David starts off by nailing to the mast and keeps there. We're being taught the absolute essential of seeking God and renouncing reliance on human strength. David rejects Saul's armor. It's not that it just didn't suit him, he wasn't used to it. That armor symbolizes reliance on human strength. And David, by rejecting it, shows reliance on divine strength rather than human equipment. His victory with simple tools, as it were, underscores the theme that God empowers the faithful regardless, in fact, contrary, so often, to human resources and resourcefulness. Well, David has clearly demonstrated his faith in the sovereignty of God. And in 1 Samuel 17:47, that becomes ever so clear. David declares that the Lord gives victory, a statement that teaches the centrality of God's will and sovereignty in the lives of his people. So where does that leave you and me? What's the desire of your heart today? What are your ambitions in the service of your God? And how do they line up? Are they driven by a desire for your glory or for God's? What is it we need to lay aside? What's our equivalent of Saul's armour? Needs to be put to one side. Our human strengths, gifts, talents, our own glories, in order to lean wholly on him. More than that. So that all of the glory goes to him. What is your prayer for your life in his service? Lord, give me a large and successful ministry or service that all the godly will look up to. Or Lord, give me something hard to do. Maybe something that looks impossible for me, so that your name and your glory will shine brightly through. You see, the call of Goliath to David was basically, come here and die. Jesus is looking for people who are ready to be cast like a seed into deep dampness and darkness in the ground, seemingly discarded there, so that from that, as it were, a death, the seed dies and then sprouts, so that from them a harvest might grow. The call of God to his people sometimes seems astonishingly like the call of Goliath, because so much that our own human nature might take us into, probably isn't for our good, needs to die. It's called repentance, you know? But God's call doesn't fail in either intention or effect to ensure that from that point the planted life will grow and bear fruit for eternity in making God's name look as great as it is amongst the nations. And that, my friends, is what the story of David and Goliath for grown-ups is all about. Well, there you have it, David and Goliath. An absolutely ripping yarn in many people's book, but actually a depiction of cosmic conflict in the battle, and a model for people to be concerned at such times of difficulty, stress, security for the nation, for their people, for their families, and so on, that the key issue for the believer is that the glory of God should be seen and known and understood. Thanks for being with us today. That's been the Word for the Week podcast. Hope you feel able to like and subscribe and whatever. And join us next time for another edition of the Word for the Week.